Baghdad. The year is 220 after the Hijra, 835 by the reckoning of the Christian world. A man is dragged into an open courtyard, his wrists raw from iron. He has not eaten properly in days. He has barely slept in months. Around him stand judges, soldiers, and a caliph who commands the largest empire on earth. All that empire wants from him is 6 words. Say the Quran is created. Say it, and the whip stops. Say it, and you walk free, wealthy, respected, safe. He does not say it. This is the story of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, a man who held the largest empire of his age in a staring contest, and did not blink. Not because he did not feel pain. Because he believed something mattered more than his own body. No armies fought for him in that courtyard. No allies stood beside him by the time the whip was raised. It was one man, chained, against the full weight of a caliphate, and somehow, it was the man in chains who did not move. To understand what happened in that courtyard, we have to go back, decades earlier, to a boy in Baghdad who had nothing unusual about him except one thing: he could not stop searching. Let us begin. Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal was born in Baghdad in the year 164 after the Hijra, 780 in the Christian calendar. His father died while he was still young, and he was raised by his mother in a household that was respected, but not wealthy. There was no inheritance waiting for him. No political family name to open doors. Baghdad, in those years, was still young itself, barely 2 decades old as a city, built by the Abbasid dynasty as their new capital, and already swelling into one of the largest urban centers on earth. Markets stretched along the Tigris. Scholars from Persia, from the Hijaz, from Central Asia, filled its mosques and courtyards, arguing over grammar, law, and the exact wording of things the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was reported to have said barely 150 years earlier. It was a city built, in part, on the idea that knowledge itself was worth chasing. Ahmed grew up breathing that air. His mother is said to have raised him carefully, within modest means, sending him early to the mosque circles where boys memorized Quran and began their first exposure to hadith. Even as a child, those who remembered him described something slightly unusual. Not brilliance in the flashy sense, but a kind of relentlessness. He did not simply want to memorize a narration. He wanted to know who had said it, and who that person had heard it from, and whether that chain could be trusted all the way back. What he had instead of wealth or lineage was an obsession, one that would define the rest of his life. He wanted to know, with total certainty, what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had actually said and done. Not what people assumed. Not what sounded reasonable. What was actually transmitted, chain by chain, name by name, back to the source. By the time he was a teenager, Ahmed was already sitting at the feet of hadith scholars in Baghdad, memorizing narrations by the thousand. But Baghdad wasn't enough. So he did something most young men of his era never did. He left. He walked. Not rode, walked, for long stretches, because he often could not afford transport. Picture it plainly: a young man with a satchel of notebooks, worn sandals, crossing open desert between cities with nothing but a waterskin and the name of a scholar he intended to find. He crossed the deserts and river valleys of the Abbasid world on foot and by caravan, chasing scholars from city to city, to Kufa, to Basra, to the Hijaz, to Mecca and Medina, to Yemen, to Syria. Wherever a man was known to hold even a handful of authentic narrations Ahmed didn't yet have, Ahmed would go, sometimes walking for weeks for a single hadith. There is a story, preserved by later biographers, of Ahmed arriving in a city so poor from the road that he had no coin left for lodging, and taking work carrying loads for merchants in the marketplace simply to eat while he attended a scholar's teaching circle by day. He never treated this as hardship worth complaining about. By his own telling, later in life, it was simply the cost of the thing he wanted, and the thing he wanted was worth any cost. By the time he settled back in Baghdad in his 30s, he had amassed a personal collection of hadith numbering, by later account, in the hundreds of thousands, a collection so vast that his son would later compile a portion of it into a single work, the Musnad, containing tens of thousands of narrations. It remains, to this day, one of the largest hadith collections ever assembled by a single scholar. Among the teachers who shaped him during these years was a younger scholar visiting Baghdad from the Hijaz, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who would go on to found his own school of Islamic law. Ahmed held him in a kind of respect he rarely extended to anyone. Later students recalled him speaking of al-Shafi'i with open admiration, crediting him with sharpening the way he himself approached legal reasoning grounded in text. Al-Shafi'i, for his part, is reported to have spoken of Ahmed with equal regard, describing him, after leaving Baghdad, as a man he had found more devoted to sound narration and cautious judgment than anyone else he had encountered in the city. Two of the greatest legal minds of the age, each one strengthening the other, rather than competing for the louder name. Tradition preserves a detail about these travel years that says as much about Ahmed as any single teaching he passed down. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca 5 times in his life, 3 of them entirely on foot. One of his own students, al-Daraki, once remarked to him that he had worn himself ragged on the journey to study under single scholar in Yemen, Abdurrazzaq al-Sanani. By the accounts handed down from his household, the walking wore actual cracks into the skin of his feet. Picture that scene for a moment, because it is easy to let the detail pass too quickly. A man in his 20s, alone on the road to Sanaa, blistered feet wrapped in cloth, still walking, not because anyone was watching, not because it would make him famous, but because somewhere ahead of him sat a single old scholar holding narrations that existed nowhere else. That is not the picture of a man chasing status. That is the picture of a man who had already decided, long before any caliph ever tested him, exactly what he was willing to suffer for. This is not incidental detail. It is the whole shape of the man, years before anyone ever raised a whip against him. Someone who would walk until his feet split open, for the sake of a single accurate narration. But numbers alone don't explain why his name would come to mean something different from every other scholar of his era. What set Ahmed apart wasn't just how much he knew. It was how he lived what he knew. Contemporaries described a man of simple dress, simple food, and simple means, who was offered positions, salaries, and gifts from the wealthy and the powerful throughout his life, and who consistently declined them, preferring to earn his living modestly rather than owe anything to men of influence. By some accounts, he supported his household for years through small trade, buying and reselling modest goods, living on little, refusing repeated offers of state stipends that other scholars of his standing accepted without hesitation. When asked, later in life, why he turned down what would have made his family's circumstances easier, his answer was consistent. A debt owed to a ruler was a debt that could one day be called in, and he did not intend to owe anyone the kind of debt that might someday cost him his voice. He built a reputation, quietly, as a man whose word could be trusted absolutely. Not because he was clever, but because he refused to bend it for anyone. Scholars who knew him described him as the most reliable narrator of his generation, a man incapable, in their estimation, of saying something he did not believe to be true. That reputation, for stubborn, immovable honesty, is exactly what would put him in the direct path of an empire. While Ahmed was building his life around hadith in Baghdad, something else was happening at the very top of the Abbasid Caliphate, something theological, and something political, tangled together in a way that would eventually reach down and touch every scholar in the empire. The Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun was, by most accounts, a genuinely brilliant man. He sponsored translation movements, funded the House of Wisdom, and surrounded himself with philosophers, astronomers, and theologians. Among the intellectual currents he was drawn to was a rationalist school of theology known as the Mu'tazila. One of the Mu'tazila's central positions concerned the nature of the Quran itself. Was the Quran, the literal speech of God, eternal, existing without beginning, as an attribute of God himself? Or was it created, brought into existence at a point in time, the way anything else in creation is brought into existence? To most people today, even to most Muslims today, this can sound like a distant, abstract argument, the kind of thing debated by scholars in a room, with no bearing on ordinary life. But in the Baghdad of the 9th century, this question was anything but abstract. It touched the very heart of how Muslims understood God, revelation, and authority. The overwhelming majority of scholars, jurists, hadith specialists, ordinary worshippers, held firmly that the Quran, as the speech of God, was uncreated. Eternal, as God is eternal. Al-Ma'mun disagreed. And al-Ma'mun was the caliph. To grasp why this mattered so intensely, it helps to understand what was really at stake underneath the theology. If the Quran was created, brought into being at a point in time, the way the sky or the sea was brought into being, then it belonged, in some sense, to the same category as everything else God had made. It could, in theory, be reasoned about, reinterpreted, and ultimately placed under the authority of whoever held the power to define what it meant. If, instead, the Quran was uncreated, the eternal, direct speech of God, without beginning, then no ruler, no judge, no institution stood above it. It could not be reshaped to fit the convenience of the age. It simply had to be submitted to, exactly as it stood. This is why a debate that sounds, on the surface, like a technical point of theology was, underneath, a question about power itself. Could the state define the boundaries of revelation, or did revelation stand permanently outside the state's reach? Was there anything in this empire that a caliph could not eventually reach and reshape? In the year 218 after the Hijra, 833, in the final months of his reign, al-Ma'mun made a decision that would outlive him by 15 years. He ordered his provincial governor in Baghdad to summon the leading judges and scholars of the city and administer a test. State, publicly, that the Quran is created. This test came to be known in history as the Mihna, an Arabic word meaning trial or ordeal. Scholars who affirmed the doctrine kept their positions, their income, their freedom. Scholars who refused faced dismissal from their posts, and for the more defiant among them, imprisonment. Most scholars, when tested, gave the answer that was asked of them, some out of genuine conviction, many others simply to avoid losing everything they had. History does not record most of their names. Fear rarely leaves a legacy, but a small number refused. And of that small number, one name would come to define the entire ordeal, because he refused not once, not twice, but for years, through interrogation, imprisonment, and finally, physical punishment, without ever giving the answer his captors wanted. Ahmad ibn Hanbal. The order reached Baghdad first, not as an abstraction, but as an instruction to one man, Ishaq ibn Ibrahim, al-Ma'mun's governor over the city. He was told to gather the leading scholars and judges of Baghdad and put the question to them directly, with a warning attached, that hardship and punishment awaited anyone who refused to comply. Imagine the room that day. Rows of the city's most respected legal minds, men who had spent decades building reputations for wisdom and restraint, suddenly asked a single question with their careers, their freedom, and possibly their lives sitting on the answer. There would have been no time to consult books, no time to debate quietly among themselves. Just a governor, a question, and a room full of men doing rapid, silent arithmetic about what they stood to lose. By the accounts of that meeting, nearly everyone in the room gave the governor the answer he had been sent to collect. Fear does that to a room full of otherwise principled people, not because they were cowards, but because the cost of refusal had just been made very plain, and most had families, students, and livelihoods that depended on them staying free. Of everyone gathered that day, only a small handful held out. And of that handful, most eventually gave way under continued pressure in the days that followed. By the end, only 2 men in the entire assembly had not bent. Ahmad ibn Hanbal was one of them. Al-Ma'mun did not live to see his policy fully carried out. He died in August of 833, only months after launching the Mihna, while campaigning near the Byzantine frontier. Before his death, he left explicit instructions for his brother and successor, al-Mu'tasim, to continue enforcing the doctrine. Al-Mu'tasim was, by most historical accounts, a different kind of ruler than his brother, less personally invested in theology, more a soldier and administrator. But he kept his brother's policy in place, and under his reign, the man most responsible for driving the Mihna forward was not the caliph himself, but his chief judge, Ahmed ibn Abi Duad, a committed Mu'tazilite who Sunni historians would later remember as the true architect of the persecution that followed. Ahmad ibn Hanbal had already been questioned once, briefly, under al-Ma'mun, and had given the same answer he would give for years to come. The Quran is the speech of God, and it is not created. Now, under the new caliph and his chief judge, Ahmed was summoned again, this time in chains, transported from Baghdad toward the seat of power for direct interrogation. Picture the scene, because it is worth picturing honestly. A scholar, by now in his 50s, a man whose entire life had been built around quiet study and careful transmission, bound, and marched under guard, toward men who held the power of life and death over him. He was not a soldier. He was not a rebel. He held no army, no wealth, no political faction behind him. He held one thing, a conviction he would not put down. The interrogation sessions that followed were not simple yes or no exchanges. According to the accounts preserved by his students and later biographers, Ahmed was pressed for hours, questioned by rotating panels of jurists loyal to the state's position, offered arguments, pressured with warnings, and reminded, repeatedly, of exactly what awaited him if he did not comply. Each time, by the accounts handed down through generations of scholars, his answer held the same shape: challenge me from the book of God, or from the authentic practice of his messenger, peace be upon him, and I will follow it. Anything else, I cannot accept simply because you have the power to compel me. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was, in his understanding, the only form of integrity available to a man who had spent his whole life insisting that truth could not be negotiated, only found, and then held on to. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go further. How many of the men who did give in that day genuinely believed what they said? And how many simply told themselves they'd fight for the truth some other way, some other day, once it was safer? History rarely answers that question for us. It only remembers who was still standing when the pressure never let up. There is a chapter of this story that rarely makes it into short retellings, but it deserves to be seen in full, because before Ahmed ever faced al-Mutazim, he first had to survive the road itself. Ahmed was not the only scholar in Baghdad who refused the doctrine of the created Quran when it was first tested under al-Ma'mun's governor. A second man, Muhammad ibn Nur, held the line beside him, and when nearly every other scholar in the city eventually gave the answer that was demanded, these two did not. Baghdad's governor made his decision. The pair would be sent, in shackles, chained one to the other, on the long road north to Tarsus, near the Byzantine frontier, to face al-Ma'mun himself. By the account preserved through his own son, Salih, Ahmed's family followed the convoy as far as they could, as far as the town of Al-Anbar, walking alongside the party carrying him away. There, one of his companions asked him, plainly, a question that must have been on everyone's mind. If they threaten you with the sword itself, would you give in? His answer, by his son's account, was a single word. No. Think about the weight sitting inside that one syllable. Not a speech. Not a declaration. Just a man, in chains, on a dusty road out of his own city, answering the worst question anyone could ask him with total, unhurried certainty. The two men were carried north, further and further from home, toward a caliph they might never even reach in time to make their case, because news soon overtook the convoy. Al-Ma'mun had died at Tarsus before they arrived. Ahmed and Muhammad ibn Nur were turned back toward Baghdad, still in chains, now traveling by river, on a prison vessel making its way down the Euphrates. Somewhere along that return journey, at a town called Aina, Muhammad ibn Nur, Ahmed's companion in refusal since the very beginning of the ordeal, died in captivity. He was buried there, far from his family, having never once recanted. Ahmed continued the journey alone. Picture that moment honestly. The one man who had stood beside him through the entire trial was gone, and Ahmed, still shackled, still uncertain what awaited him, kept moving toward a capital ruled now by a new caliph he had never faced before. No companion left to share the silence of the boat with. Just the sound of the river, the weight of iron on his wrists, and a question he could not yet answer. Would this new caliph be harder to face, or easier? What followed was not a single dramatic confrontation, but something slower and, in its own way, crueler, prolonged imprisonment. Accounts preserved by his son Salih describe Ahmed first held for a few nights near the old palace of Umara in Baghdad, before being transferred into what was known as the commoner's prison, on a street the sources call Marsali, an ordinary jail, holding ordinary prisoners, with no special treatment extended to a man the whole city already knew by name. Prison in 9th century Baghdad was not a place designed for comfort or dignity. Ahmed was held in heavy iron restraints for an extended stretch, by some accounts close to 2 years in total confinement. And yet, even here, something in how he carried himself left an impression on everyone around him. His son recalled him saying, plainly, that he led his fellow prisoners in the 5 daily prayers, chains and all, because someone in that cell had to, and no one else was willing to take the lead. There is a smaller detail from this period, easy to miss, that says something about the kind of man he was even at his lowest point. Fellow prisoners, men held for ordinary crimes, with no interest at all in theology, began coming to him with their own questions, about prayer, about fasting, about disputes with their families. A man in chains, uncertain if he would live to see trial again, still made time to answer them. Not because anyone required it of him. Because, in his own words to those close to him, a person does not stop being useful to God simply because his hands are bound. What the historical sources emphasize, again and again, is not complaint. Ahmed is not remembered as a man who protested his conditions loudly. He is remembered for something quieter, for continuing, even in confinement, to answer questions about hadith and religious practice from other prisoners and visitors, for keeping his prayers on schedule, for treating even his guards with basic courtesy. Those who came into contact with him in this period did not describe a broken man. They described a man waiting, calmly, and on his own terms. There is one exchange from this period, preserved by those close to him, that captures the atmosphere of those years better than any description could. Someone visiting him, trying, perhaps, to comfort him, or perhaps to test his resolve, said to him, "Look at this, right has lost, and wrong has won." Ahmed's reply came without hesitation, "Never. Wrong only wins if people's hearts wander off and lose their way, and ours have not done that yet." Outside the prison walls, a household waited. Ahmed had a wife and young children at home in Baghdad, among them his son Salih, who would grow up to become one of the main sources for exactly the details preserved in this account. The shackles, the prison on Marsali Street, the exchange about the sword, the words about wrong never truly winning. It is worth remembering, when we picture Ahmed alone in a cell, that the cost of his refusal was never his alone to carry. It was carried, too, by a family with no certainty when, or whether, he would return to them. Periodically, he was brought back before panels of interrogators. The pattern repeated: pressure, argument, refusal. Some of his contemporaries, faced with the same pressure, eventually gave the answer that was demanded of them and were released, a fact Ahmed is not recorded as ever holding against them personally. He understood the weight of what was being asked. He simply could not carry it himself, not by saying words he did not believe. Years passed this way. An empire, with all its judges, soldiers, and administrative machinery, applied sustained pressure to a single scholar, and the scholar did not move. So here's the second question worth carrying with you into the next part of this story. What does an empire actually do when its full weight, every judge, every soldier, every threat it can make, fails to move one unarmed man? We're about to find out exactly how far al-Mu'tasim was willing to go to find an answer. Eventually, the matter was brought directly before Caliph al-Mu'tasim himself, in a formal session in Baghdad. This is the moment later biographers would return to again and again, the confrontation at the center of the entire ordeal. By the accounts preserved in early biographical literature, the trial before al-Mu'tasim stretched across 3 separate days. Each day, Ahmed was brought into a hall filled with the caliph's assembled judges, chief among them Ibn Abi Duad, and each day the same questions returned, dressed in slightly different arguments, from slightly different scholars, all converging on the same demand. Picture that hall, rows of trained legal minds, robed and seated, each one prepared with a different angle of argument, a different verse, a different chain of logic, all aimed at a single exhausted man standing in chains in the center of the room. It was not one interrogation. It was 3 days of rotating pressure, each fresh scholar hoping to find the one argument that would finally crack him where every previous one had failed. By the 3rd day, accounts described the caliph himself growing weary of the process, not softening, but tiring of a confrontation that refused to resolve itself the way every previous one had. He is reported to have called Ahmed aside for something closer to a private conversation than a formal interrogation, asking him, almost pleading, to yield just a little, enough to give the caliph a reason, any reason, to let him go free with his dignity and his life intact. It is worth sitting with that moment. This was not a caliph demanding submission from a stranger he despised. By several accounts, he seemed, in that instant, to want a way out for both of them. Ahmed's answer did not change. Show him the proof, from the Quran or from the authentic practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he would follow it without hesitation. Anything less, and there was nothing left to discuss. And in one exchange remembered across centuries of retelling, when pressed to simply repeat the phrase demanded of him, Ahmed is reported to have turned the pressure back on his interrogator, asking Ibn Abi Duad to whisper the words he wanted said, so that Ahmed could show him, plainly, that neither of them could offer proof for it from the Quran or from the practice of the Prophet, peace be upon him. It was, in its way, a small act of theater, a scholar, in chains, still insisting on evidence, still refusing to let the conversation move away from the only ground he considered solid. The caliph, according to these accounts, grew visibly frustrated. And frustration, in a room where one man holds absolute power, rarely stays contained for long. Ahmad ibn Hanbal was ordered flogged. The precise details of what followed differ between historical sources, some describing dozens of lashes, others describing a much higher number administered across repeated sessions. What is consistent across nearly every account is this: he was struck, publicly, by order of the state, for refusing to say 6 words he did not believe. He is reported to have lost consciousness at points during the ordeal, and to have been revived, and struck again, and each time he was able to speak, his answer did not change. There is a detail preserved in several early biographies that captures, perhaps better than any number of lashes could, the nature of what was happening in that courtyard. That even as his body was failing him, his mind stayed fixed on the same handful of words. The Quran is the speech of God. It is not created, repeated not as a slogan, but as a man reciting the one thing he had left that no whip could take from him. Think about what that actually required. Not one moment of courage, held for a single breath, but courage renewed, over and over, every time consciousness returned. Every time he was revived, he had a fresh choice in front of him. Say the words now, end it now, or hold the line one more time, not knowing if his body could survive another round. And every single time, by every account handed down, he chose the same answer. Eventually, accounts differ on the exact turning point, some describing the caliph's own hesitation, others describing pressure from advisors warning of public unrest if the beating continued. The flogging stopped. Ahmad ibn Hanbal was still alive. Ahmed was released from custody without ever having given the caliphate the words it wanted. He returned to his home in Baghdad, not triumphant, not seeking vindication, but by most accounts wanting exactly what he had wanted before all of it began: to be left alone with his books, his students, and his prayers. He did not organize a rebellion. He did not publicly denounce the caliph. He is not recorded as ever taking pride, in the way we might expect, in what he endured. When people came to him afterward treating him as something close to a legend, the accounts describe a man visibly uncomfortable with the attention, someone who wanted the entire episode spoken of, if at all, only as something that had simply happened to him, not as an achievement he had sought. The Mihna itself did not end with Ahmed's release. It continued, with somewhat less intensity, through the reign of the next caliph, al-Wathiq, who maintained his father's policy for several more years. Ahmed, for a portion of this period, largely withdrew from public teaching, cautious about drawing further attention, though he never appears to have privately wavered from his position. It is worth pausing here on one more name, not to shift focus away from Ahmed, but to make clear that what he survived was never a foregone conclusion. During al-Wathiq's reign, another scholar, Ahmed ibn Nasr al-Khuzai, was tested on the same question and refused in the same way, and where Ahmed ibn Hanbal was eventually released, Ibn Nasr was executed for his refusal. The line between the two outcomes was never guaranteed. Ahmed ibn Hanbal did not walk away from the Mihna because the danger was smaller than it looked. He walked away because, by whatever combination of circumstance and mercy history records only imperfectly, the whip stopped before it killed him, and he never once relied on that outcome while it was happening. Then, in the year 232 after the Hijra, 847, everything changed, though not because of anything Ahmed did. A new caliph, al-Mutawakkil, came to power, and unlike his predecessors, he had no appetite for continuing the Mihna. Within roughly a year of his accession, he formally reversed the policy, ending the Inquisition, restoring dismissed judges, and publicly affirming the very position Ahmed had been beaten for holding, that the Quran is the uncreated speech of God. The empire that had once ordered a scholar whipped for refusing 6 words now adopted those 6 words as its own official position. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. Nothing about the theology itself had changed in those 14 years. The Quran was exactly what it had always been. What changed was only who happened to sit on the throne, which means everything Ahmed endured, every lash, every year of confinement, had been demanded by a state position that turned out to have no more permanence than the ruler enforcing it. He had risked his life for a truth that outlasted the men who tried to overrule it. That is, in the end, the entire lesson sitting quietly underneath this story. Ahmed ibn Hanbal lived for another 8 years after the Mihna's end, continuing to teach hadith in Baghdad, his home increasingly crowded with students eager to study not only under a great scholar of prophetic tradition, but under a man who had, in the plainest possible terms, shown them what it looked like to hold a conviction under pressure. Among the students who passed through his circle during these decades were names that would themselves become foundational to Islamic scholarship: Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, whose hadith collections remain the 2 most trusted in Sunni Islam, both studied under him or in circles shaped by him. The legal school that would eventually carry his name, the Hanbali Madhab, grew out of the way he taught his students to reason from text, cautiously, precisely, and without straying further from the Quran and prophetic practice than the evidence allowed. Those who studied under him in these final years described a teacher who never once brought up his own suffering as a way of asserting authority over a room. He taught the same way he always had, patiently, precisely, correcting a misremembered chain of narration as carefully as he had corrected them decades earlier, long before any caliph had ever heard his name. He died in Baghdad in the year 241 after the Hijra, 855, and the accounts describe a funeral of almost unimaginable size, with contemporary estimates, however imprecise by modern standards, describing a crowd in the hundreds of thousands lining the streets of Baghdad to see him carried to his grave. It is reported that even people who had never studied a single hadith under him came out simply to witness the passing of a man they had heard could not be bought, could not be broken, and could not be made to say what he did not believe, even by the most powerful ruler on earth. It would be easy to file this story away as a piece of distant theological history, an argument about the nature of scripture, settled by a caliph centuries ago, with no real bearing on anyone alive today. It would be easy, too, to reduce it to a simple morality tale, a hero, a villain, a lesson wrapped up neatly by the time the credits roll. Real history rarely offers that kind of neatness, and this story doesn't either. Al-Mutazim was not a cartoon tyrant. By several accounts, he seemed genuinely uneasy with what he was doing by the end. Ibn Abi Duad believed, by all appearances, that he was defending a serious theological position, not simply persecuting a rival for sport. And Ahmed himself never claimed to be a hero. He consistently described his own resistance not as bravery, but simply as the only option available to a man who could not bring himself to say something he did not believe. That would miss the point entirely. What makes Ahmed ibn Hanbal's story endure isn't the specific theological dispute at its center. It's the shape of the choice he faced, a shape that repeats itself, in different forms, in every generation. Say what is convenient, and keep everything. Say what you believe to be true, and risk losing everything. Most people, most of the time, choose the first option. History rarely blames them for it. Survival is not a small thing. But it remembers, with a particular kind of reverence, the rare person who chooses the second option, not out of stubbornness for its own sake, not out of a desire for fame or martyrdom, but simply because they have decided that some things are not theirs to trade away, no matter who is asking, and no matter what is offered in return. Think, too, about what he did not do with the moment once it had passed. He did not turn his suffering into a weapon. He did not build a movement around his own persecution, or spend his remaining years reminding people of what had been done to him. By every account, he seemed almost eager for the whole episode to be forgotten, not because he regretted his stand, but because the stand itself had never been about him. It had been about a single sentence he believed to be true, and once that sentence no longer needed defending, he had nothing further to prove to anyone. That, too, is a kind of lesson easy to overlook. The measure of his integrity wasn't only that he refused to bend under the whip. It was that he didn't need the story afterward, didn't need the applause, the recognition, or the legend that grew up around him anyway, almost against his will. Ahmed ibn Hanbal held no army. He commanded no territory. He never sought power, and by every account, he actively avoided it. And yet, more than 1,000 years after his death, his name is still spoken, not because of what he built, but because of what he refused to say. None of us today will likely ever stand before a caliph, or face a whip for a theological position. But nearly everyone, at some point, faces a smaller version of the same test, a moment where saying what's convenient would cost nothing, and saying what's true would cost something real. A job, a friendship, a reputation carefully built over years. Ahmed ibn Hanbal's story doesn't ask us to imagine ourselves in a 9th century prison. It asks something quieter, and in some ways harder, whether we would recognize our own version of that courtyard when it finally arrived, and whether, in that moment, we would know what we actually believed enough to keep. The whip has long since turned to dust. The empire that wielded it is gone. The 6 words he refused to say, and the words he insisted on instead, are still recited, studied, and taught, in every corner of the world, to this day. His Musnad is still opened by students of hadith today, and his name is still spoken with respect by scholars who never met him, simply because everyone who studies his life recognizes exactly what it cost him, and exactly what he refused to trade it for. That is what outlasts power. Not the ones who hold the whip. The ones who would not bend beneath it. Thank you for watching.